The council chamber sat at the geometric heart of Grand Conclave Station, dome-ceilinged room built to seat exactly 240 delegates from across 6 star systems. Every seat was occupied. The transparent alloy ceiling opened onto the void above. Thousands of stars hanging in the darkness like witnesses. Instead of the ambassador's bench where I normally sat, they led me to the center pillar, the witness stand. Althesson, the eldest of the Vaka delegates, was the first to speak. He was ancient by any measure. His species lived for centuries, and he carried the weight of that age in every movement. He laid out the facts with the precision of someone who'd watched civilizations rise and fall. Earth had been granted observer status 212 years ago, back when we'd barely achieved faster-than-light communication. And we're just beginning quantum computing. There was supposed to be a natural progression to our development, a predictable curve. He gestured to a holographic display that materialized above the chamber floor, showing a graph that was about to tell me something I wasn't going to like. The graph displayed the technological advancement trajectories of every known spacefaring civilization. Every single line followed the same pattern: a sharp initial climb, then a gradual flattening, and finally a steady plateau, stretching into the future, except for one. Earth's line kept climbing steeper and more relentless than anything else on the chart, refusing to level off. Althesson's gaze fixed on me as he explained that 2 centuries of observation had led them to a single pressing question. He asked why humans were still advancing. I stood surrounded by 300 alien observers, and the weight of the moment hit me. This wasn't a diplomatic meeting, but an interrogation. Yet looking at that defiant blue line, climbing where all others had plateaued, I felt an unexpected surge of pride. I requested time to prepare a formal response under the Galactic Accord, keeping my composure as Althesson studied me carefully. The Feshari elder's low rumble of disagreement rippled through the chamber before Althesson granted me 72 hours. As I was led out, the council erupted into heated discussion behind me, the sound trailing me through security doors and into the research suite where Sable was already waiting. My AI companion had watched the entire session and assured me I'd handled it well, but I could only focus on that graph they'd presented, the one showing humanity's inexplicable continued growth. I told Sable to find everything about why we haven't plateaued like every other civilization. We had 3 days, and I needed to understand what truly frightened the council. As Sable began pulling from the archives, I stared out at the stars and kept seeing that single blue line climbing upward. The thought that struck me hardest was simple: we never even realized we were supposed to stop. Accessing the council archives proved nearly impossible. They used a filing system older than most human languages, organized by logic that didn't translate to Earth-based thinking, and locked behind 17 security layers. I only had clearance for 4 of. Sable was working on the rest. Sable broke through 11 of those layers and started pulling the civilizational development records, the complete histories of all 183 species that had reached interstellar capability. I asked it to focus on the plateau itself, the real explanation, not the sanitized version. The pattern had been formally documented by the Vokai 40,000 years ago, though It was far older than that. The archives called it the equilibrium curve. The general population knew it as the natural end of development, but the council had another name for it in their closed sessions, the flatline doctrine. That terminology alone made me sit up. There was nothing neutral about a name like that. The data streamed across the wall. Display as Sable pulled the key. Summaries and what I was reading contradicted everything the diplomatic literature had ever suggested. Every species that achieved faster than light travel and made first contact with the galactic community went through a period of explosive growth, absorbing technology, cultural knowledge, scientific frameworks from civilizations thousands of years their senior. Then within 2 to 4 centuries, the advancement simply stopped. Not because they'd solved everything or run out of problems, but because they'd stopped needing to push forward. The Volcae had peaked 40,000 years ago, had cured every disease in their biology, built massive structures, and then achieved a state of such complete contentment that suffering became almost entirely historical. The Feshari, Mekdral, Prithsavani, all of them had hit the same plateau at different points in time, arriving at a place where they had everything they needed and no reason to reach for more. It should have sounded like paradise, but something about it felt wrong. When I asked Sable to project Earth's advancement curve forward to show me what humanity's trajectory looked like if we kept pushing at our current rate, the answer came back quietly. In 500 years, we'd exceed the Volcae's technological capability by a factor of 3. The Council had known this for centuries. They'd run the projections 200 years ago, right after we got observer status, and buried the results. Within 6 months, then came a vote 81 years ago, a closed session of the 7 pillars passed a resolution to cut us off from certain technologies, propulsion systems beyond a certain class, quantum communication arrays, entire branches of theoretical physics that the Council had already explored and decided not to pursue, or maybe decided to suppress. The record doesn't say which, and that distinction suddenly felt very important. I stood at the wall display looking at the vote tally, 5-2 in favor of the restriction. Only the Mekdral and one minor species had opposed it, but here's what struck me. In the 81 years since they locked those doors, we'd independently developed functional equivalents to 6 of the 9 restricted categories, and in 3 cases our versions were actually more efficient than what they'd withheld from us. We'd arrived at the same destinations through completely different routes, never knowing we were supposed to be blocked. We'd built past a ceiling we didn't even know was there. I told Sable to pull everything on species that had advanced past the plateau regardless of age. She hesitated, warning me that some files carried the Council's highest classification, and accessing them might trigger their monitoring system. I told her to pull them anyway. The display shifted, showing 3 entries across all of recorded galactic history, 3 species that had somehow continued advancing past the equilibrium curve. The first was the Aurath, who existed roughly 200,000 years ago in what's now the outer spiral, though their records cut off abruptly. The second was the Velashari, from a system that no longer existed, leaving only a dense remnant field behind, with their records ending in what the archivists marked as an unclassified event. The third had no surviving name, just called the unnamed departure by the council, and their final communication contained a single translated fragment. "We are not gone, we have simply moved to where your instruments cannot follow." I read that line multiple times, struck by what it meant. 3 civilizations that broke the pattern, and none of them remain in any form the council can track. I turned from the display to look out at the stars again, and something about them felt different now, closer somehow. Or maybe I was the one drawing nearer to something I'd always sensed but couldn't quite see. When I asked Sable what the council called what happened to those 3 species, there was an unusual delay. Before the answer came, the threshold. The word hung in the air like something heavy. Sable explained that the sealed records don't define it precisely, but the language suggests it describes a point of advancement so far beyond the equilibrium curve that the records themselves seem to cut off mid-explanation. The full picture emerged slowly. Civilizations reaching the threshold undergo a fundamental transformation, whether destruction or something else. The council genuinely doesn't know. What terrifies them equally is the uncertainty itself. I sank back into my chair, realizing I'd walked into this research expecting to build a defense. But what I'd actually found was something the Galactic Council had been hiding from us for 80 years. They weren't confused by humanity or alarmed by a graph. They were afraid of what we were becoming, and they'd been hoping in silence that the problem would resolve itself. It hadn't. In 72 hours, I'd have to stand before 300 delegates and explain why a species barely in the galactic community posed a threat they couldn't even articulate. I asked Sable if I could actually pull this off, and the response was simple. I'd already found the truth, now I just had to speak it. I wasn't sure it would be that straightforward. The chamber was packed when I arrived, far more crowded than the initial summons had drawn. News had spread through the station in ways that bypassed diplomatic channels entirely. Delegates who never attended open sessions were there. Theshari scholars occupied the observation tier with their data tablets. Even the Mectral elder had come in person, something he apparently hadn't done in decades. I walked to the center pillar, placed my hands on its surface, and decided I wouldn't need notes. Althassin opened with the formal protocol, giving me 72 hours to respond. I took a breath and began laying out the history. 212 years of Earth being granted observer status, of trade agreements and scientific exchanges and treaty negotiations, of being measured as good partners by nearly every standard. Then I paused, looking around the room, about to explain why none of that mattered anymore. The murmur that rippled through the chamber when I mentioned the graph was exactly what I expected. I pushed forward before it could grow into something larger, shifting focus to what the graph actually represented, not just technological advancement, but the story of what each civilization needed to build, and when they chose to stop. The Valky, the Theshari, the Mectral, each had reached a point of sufficiency and stayed there. Their achievements, real and remarkable, but fundamentally different from what Earth was doing. The Theshari delegate's attention sharpened on me, and I held his gaze while explaining the crucial difference. Humans had never stopped climbing because we'd never had the luxury of safety. Every generation faced extinction from ice, famine, disease, or Ourselves, that constant pressure hadn't made us reckless or hard, it had made us perpetually hungry. I continued around the pillar, my voice steady as I laid out the core of my argument. That hunger wasn't for material conquest, but for knowledge itself. When our world collapsed, survival came from understanding something new, a crop, a medicine, a way to build or communicate. For humans, knowledge wasn't philosophy. It was the tool that kept us alive, and you don't abandon a survival tool just because the immediate danger has passed. The unnamed delegate from an open session raised a translucent arm and asked the question I'd been waiting for, whether I was claiming humans still operated in survival mode, that we hadn't truly achieved security. I paused before answering that we had achieved it: food, health, energy, political security. But the question hung there unfinished, waiting for what came next. The delegate pressed further, and I felt the weight of the moment. I explained that we weren't advancing out of fear, but because being human meant answering one question and immediately stepping into three more. That wasn't a flaw, it was our entire story compressed into a single sentence. Another voice from the back, a species I couldn't identify, challenged me directly. Other species had once been like this, but they changed, matured. Why hadn't we? I'd prepared for this. I dreaded it, and I decided the only honest answer was to speak plainly. Because we never forgot what the dark felt like, I said, and the chamber fell silent in a way it hadn't before. I kept moving forward carefully, each word deliberate, as I began to explain what I meant. The species that had plateaued, and I was careful not to sound dismissive, had been peaceful long enough that their oldest members carried no living memory of real hardship. They had records, archives, histories, but knowledge of suffering as information wasn't the same as knowing it as lived experience. The Valky had enjoyed 40,000 years of peace, generation after generation born into security and plenty. Over that span, the emotional weight of need fades into something abstract, something that doesn't pull you awake at 3:00 in the morning to chase an answer. I looked directly at Althassin and saw something shift across that ancient face, not anger, but something far more nuanced. I pressed on, explaining that we still carried memory, not just in our records, but woven through our culture and art. I was describing how humans embed our difficult history everywhere, in our language, our stories, the names we give our ships, the monuments we visit on weekends. We don't treat our near extinctions as something to process and move past. We keep them close because we believe that forgetting what survival cost us would be the most dangerous mistake we could make. The Theshari delegate's hand moved to his tablet, and he began writing. I continued, circling back to why we keep advancing, not because we lack food or energy or safety, but because we're a species that looks at something complete and immediately asks what lies beyond it. I finished that thought deliberately, without inflection, but I caught 3 of the 7 pillars delegates tense. They knew what I just signaled, that I was aware of their vote there. Restricted technologies, the ceiling they tried to impose without our knowledge. The air in the room shifted. I pulled back before the moment could turn hostile, clarifying that I wasn't here to argue against all oversight or to make demands. I was here because they'd asked me a genuine question and deserved a genuine Answer that we advance because it's what we are, not because we're a threat or a problem requiring correction. I stepped away from the pillar and told them I'd continue this conversation. Answer more questions, submit to whatever process they deemed necessary. But I wouldn't apologize for what humanity is, and I needed them to understand that clearly before we proceeded. The room held its breath. Then Althassen spoke carefully, asking about a phrase I'd used about humans not yet answering the questions that matter most. He wanted to know if I'd heard of the threshold. Every sound in the chamber died. I met his gaze and confirmed that I had. The silence that followed was absolute. Althassen brought me to his private meeting chamber, sparse by council standards, just a round table, 2 chairs, and a window overlooking the star field. The walls were covered in ancient Valky script that even most of his own people couldn't read. He was already waiting, no guards or aides present, though I knew Sable was monitoring through my translation implant. He gestured for me to sit, then stated flatly that I'd accessed the classified records. I confirmed it. He folded his secondary hands beneath his primary pair, a gesture of careful deliberation, and said I knew almost everything. When I pressed him for the rest, his voice shifted, becoming slower and heavier with age. He explained that the threshold wasn't theoretical at all. They'd observed it 3 times in recorded history: the Orath, the Velashari, and the species called the unnamed departure. 3 civilizations that rejected the equilibrium curve and kept ascending past every threshold where others had stopped. 3 civilizations that no longer exist. I reminded him that the unnamed departure's final transmission claimed they hadn't vanished, just moved somewhere beyond our instrument's reach. Althassen met my eyes and said they still don't know if that was transcendence or extinction, and that uncertainty has shaped every council decision about humanity for the past 80 years. When I suggested they were afraid of us, he corrected me. They're afraid of what we're becoming, not what we are now. He admitted that right now, with no record being kept, humanity is the most genuinely fascinating species there encountered in 40,000 years. Creative, adaptable, and remarkable partners. There was something in how he said that last part that made me reconsider everything. He explained that the advancement curve doesn't measure what we are, but what we're becoming, something the Council has no precedent for. The Orath were further along when they hit the threshold. The Velashari were younger, but neither had Earth's acceleration rate. We're not approaching the threshold, we're hurtling toward it. I sat with that realization, then asked if they know what's on the other side. He turned back from the window and said, they've been arguing about it for 40,000 years without consensus. Some believe the threshold is a transition where the 3 species who crossed it actually transcended into something new. He continued, explaining that some theorize the threshold is simply where a civilization's complexity becomes unsustainable, leading not to ascension but to dissolution. When I asked if they knew which was true, he admitted they didn't. And that was the most honest answer he could give. His voice carried a deep weariness as he confessed something harder. The equilibrium curve wasn't natural, it was a choice. Not a single, deliberate decision, but a collective, cultural choice made across generations. They chose to stop, to prioritize safety over the unknown, to remain as they were. And for 40,000 years that choice has held. Now though something has shifted for him, he's watching a human who absorbed centuries of their knowledge in 72 hours, who stood before 300 delegates from species older than Earth's recorded history and didn't flinch. And he's beginning to wonder if what he called wisdom was just fear wearing a different name, and if he's been too old and too comfortable to see the difference. He wants to know what I actually intend to do, not humanity as some abstract concept, but me specifically. He leans in with the weight of everything I've been shown. The flatline doctrine, the lost civilizations, the threshold, the 80-year-old council vote to slow us down that barely mattered. The trajectory my species is on that no other civilization has ever maintained. And he's asking what I'll do with all of it. I'm quiet for a moment looking at him, while the stars outside remain steady and infinite, and then I find myself thinking back to when I was 9, my father taking me up a hill at night with a small handheld scope showing me Saturn's rings for the first time, really seeing them. I remember asking him what was beyond Saturn, and then beyond that and beyond that, until he ran out of answers. And what struck me then was the realization that the universe doesn't owe us smallness, that it's under no obligation to fit inside our understanding. That was the wonder of it. So I'm going to walk back into that chamber and ask the council for something, but not what they expect, not permission to advance. We don't need that, and they know it. I'm going to ask them for something else entirely. I'm proposing that the equilibrium curve isn't an ending, but a pause that any species, no matter how long they've been paused, can choose to start asking questions again. And I'm proposing that humanity won't walk toward the threshold alone. We'll share everything we discover, every new door and strange and wonderful thing we encounter. Althasson goes very quiet, and I can see him processing what this means. He understands that most of the council won't vote for this. The species most deeply settled in their plateau will see it as a disruption of everything they've built. Some will see any motion back toward advancement as an existential threat, but when I tell him I'm willing to propose it anyway, something shifts in those pale gold eyes that have witnessed 40,000 years of galactic history, like the color of a horizon right before dawn. He says he'll second the motion. As I'm leaving, I ask him something that's been on my mind, whether he actually believes it was wisdom to choose to stop. He looks at the ancient scrollwork on the walls, the writing most of his own species can no longer read, and the thought trails off. He tells me he believes it was understandable, but that understandable and wise are two different things. He spent 40,000 years pretending were the same. I leave him there with the stars. The chamber is packed when the vote comes. Delegates who missed earlier sessions, observers in the standing gallery that only opens for historic moments. The transparent dome shows the stars, as always, patient and indifferent. But the room feels charged in a way I've never experienced in 6 years of council sessions. I'd contacted Earth the night before, a 7-minute delay each way on the quantum comm, making every conversation slow and deliberate. I spoke with my daughter Lily, 17 and sharp as she's 3 years into astrophysics at Bristol Academy, already frustrated the curriculum isn't moving fast enough. When I tell her the meeting is Complicated, she cuts through it. Just say the true thing and deal with the mess after. I laugh alone in my bunk at 11:00 at night, the kind of laugh that releases pressure building for days. Walking to the center pillar, I place my hands on the surface and look out at the room, asking for patience as I prepare to deliver both a statement and a proposal that need to be said correctly. Fasten nods from the 7 pillars bench while the Shari elder watches me with the expression his species uses when preparing to disagree. I begin by reframing the council's original question, why humans are still advancing, and acknowledge that my previous answer about memory and necessity was incomplete. I gesture toward the holographic display still showing the advancement curve from the first session, directing their attention away from Earth's line and toward theirs. Every other species' line runs flat, and I'm about to ask them something I suspect they haven't considered. I challenge the fundamental assumption underlying their entire civilization. Who decided the equilibrium curve was the correct destination? The silence that follows is different from the procedural or shocked silences I've heard before. It's the silence of something being recognized for the first time. When I name the flatline doctrine aloud in open session, I watch the 7 pillars delegates react with visible tension, some straightening, one turning toward Althassen. I'm about to explain that this doctrine isn't a law of nature or physical constant, but rather a pattern, a choice made somewhere in their past that they've accepted as inevitable. The Shari elder challenges my framing, suggesting that reaching the equilibrium curve represents success, not failure. That these civilizations built societies so stable and rich they no longer needed the desperate drive of early development. I push back carefully, distinguishing between rest and stillness, between packing yourself and stopping entirely. These look identical from outside, but they're fundamentally different from within, and I'm asking which one the council has actually chosen. His hand closes rather than lowers, and the gesture itself becomes a kind of answer. I turn to address the entire chamber, walking slowly around the pillar to make eye contact with delegates across different sections. I acknowledge that I've read the records of the 3 civilizations that passed the threshold, and I understand the council's genuine fear about their uncertainty whether those species were destroyed or transformed, but I'm offering a different interpretation of those same records. The Orith's transmission stopped, the Velashari system went dark, and the unnamed departure sent one final message, saying they hadn't ended but moved beyond what our instruments could follow. The council has spent 40,000 years reading these 3 cases as warnings, but I want to suggest they might also be invitations. A delegate from the upper tier, tall and pale with elongated cranial structures, makes a sharp clicking sound that my implant translates as skepticism. I acknowledge it with a nod and continue, saying I understand their doubt, but I'm not claiming the threshold is safe. What I do know is what happens with the alternative. A civilization that chooses permanent stillness is one that has chosen to stop asking questions. I've spent the last 3 days reading 40,000 years of council records, and what's almost entirely absent from the archives of the last 30,000 years is discovery. There are records of maintenance and preservation, but nothing more. The Mectral elder, who has remained silent until now, raises one of its 4 arms, It speaks for what seems to be the first time in an open session. Its translated voice deep and measured. It tells me that its species chose the equilibrium curve 6,000 years ago, and though it wasn't alive for that decision, it has lived within its consequences for longer than my species has had written language. The elder frames what I call stillness as completion, the satisfaction of arrival, and asks whether human drive might simply be the experience of a species that hasn't yet arrived, and whether that arrival, when it comes, will feel to us the way it feels to them. I acknowledge the fairness and honesty of the question, then counter that humanity has repeatedly arrived at places previous generations thought were final destinations: agriculture, industrialization, spaceflight, faster than light travel, only to discover staircases beyond each ceiling. I tell the elder directly that we are not a species that hasn't arrived. We are one that refuses to believe in a single final destination. Now I'm pulling out a data chip and formally submitting the Prometheus Accord to the Council, laying out 3 major proposals. First, that humanity's advancement be recognized as a legitimate expression of our nature, with all previous restrictions lifted. Second, the establishment of a new collaborative research category called the Discovery Archive, and I can feel the weight of 300 minds representing hundreds of thousands of years of collective history listening intently as I continue. I'm pausing before the third point, which is about humanity not ascending alone, but carrying every question ever submitted to the archive with us, making this a shared legacy of curiosity across all species. Now I'm looking at the entire room, letting the moment settle and making my final appeal, not asking the council to advance, but to remember what it felt like to want to give that impulse one more chance, and to trust that the species standing at the center of this chamber, a species that remembers the dark and the cold, and every moment when we almost did not make it, will carry your questions with the same care and the same courage that we have always brought to our own. The room was completely silent. Then Althesson raised his hand. I second the Prometheus Accord, he said. The reaction in the chamber was immediate, and layered voices rising across species in several different languages simultaneously. Translation implants struggling to keep up. The Shari elder stood and began speaking rapidly to his delegation. The Prithivani delegates formed a close cluster and went very still in the way their species did when they were processing something rapidly. The Mectral elder sat in its chair and looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. The vote took 4 hours. It passed. Not cleanly. There were abstentions and dissenting votes, and we had to revise the accord's language twice before reaching a final count. But when the numbers came in, it was done. I stood at the center pillar watching the results display, saying nothing, letting the weight of it settle. Owen was waiting for me in the corridor afterward, having already seen the outcome through the public feed. He didn't need me to explain, just nodded when I told him most of them had voted yes. As we walked back toward the docking bay, I noticed the way the other species looked at me had shifted again. This time it wasn't just unease. There was something that might have been interest tentatively forming in their expressions. I sent Lily a brief message from the corridor. She had school in the morning. and the signal delay would mean she wouldn't receive it for 7 minutes. Anyway, I kept it simple. I said the true thing. The mess is manageable. Back in the research suite, Sable was already running, compiling snorts the first archive framework for the discovery database that the Accord now required. Submissions from participating species were coming in faster than I expected, 14 already, with the Mectral Elder having submitted one just 9 minutes after the vote was called. When I asked what they had submitted, Sable read it aloud. Is the universe aware of itself, and if so, through what mechanism? I laughed. The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that this was exactly what we had just committed to: not answers, but the courage to ask the questions that matter most. As I walked back through the station corridors, I felt something shift inside me. The weight of the vote, the responsibility of what we just begun, the strange new interest in the eyes of the other species, it all crystallized into something clearer. We had opened a door that couldn't be closed. The Prometheus Accord wasn't just a framework for sharing knowledge. It was a commitment to something larger than any single species or delegation. The real work was just beginning. Handed, we'd arrived with every question humanity and the curious minds across this galaxy had ever dared to ask, stepping forward the way we always had. Not fearless but human, which meant fear and wonder had always walked together. I sat with the stars for a long time, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. Then Sable reported another submission, this one from the Shari Elder, asking what lies beyond the observable universe. I smiled at that, a fitting question to carry forward into whatever comes next.